Hi everyone, I wanted to just do a really quick colour chemistry video today about chromatic neutrals. Now, often these will be called chromatic blacks, but I really do feel in watercolour we don't really use black because we've always got water present, so it will always look grey. So I tend to personally use the word neutrals to describe those blacks as we would use them in watercolour, with the caveat that you can buy carbon black, lamp black, ivory black, and so on in tubes or half pans, which are pure blacks. My main use personally for those is silhouettes where I need really strong contrast, like in the Svalbard series of paintings, which are on my website, which I'll link to in the iCards now so you can see them, which are Aurora Borealis images with a very high contrast silhouette over the top, painted in lamp black, I think. Might be ivory black, can't remember. It's been about 3 months since I painted the last one of those because the muse has not been with me for that series of paintings. What we commonly tend to do in watercolour is one of 2 or 3 things. There are a couple of neutrals one can buy in tubes. Paynes Gray is the one most people know. There is also something called neutral tint. There is also something called shadow, which are also similar mixtures of lots of colours together to give a neutral, a chromatic neutral as we would call it. And there are mixtures we all use. There is the sort of old faithful burnt sienna with French ultramarine, which I think nearly every watercolourist on the planet uses as a shadow colour. And Jane Blundell in Australia, who is a fantastic watercolourist. She has a blog, but she's not on YouTube. So I'll link to her in the description, because I can't put her in the iCards. iCards just for non-YouTubers. We can only link to other YouTube videos or our own approved website. We can't link to like Amazon or another blogger or whatever. Anyway, Jane teaches and she sets up palettes that she posts or gives to her students. She pre-mixes them from the tubes like I do for that burnt sienna French ultramarine mix, and she pre-mixes them to get a pretty neutral grey, so not biased in either direction. And she, for the sake of ease of teaching, calls that Jane's Grey in parody of Paynes Gray. She's not doing it in an arrogant way, it's purely kind of parody. So I call that Jane's Grey as well, for the neutral mixture where you have them in the right proportions to give you no bias, no cold bias, no warm bias. And that is not done by mixing equal volumes from the tubes, because depending on manufacturer and which batch number of the paint, the pigments are not going to be in exact proportions. So what you will need to do is play with them to get it right. And actually what I have on my palettes at any point in time are a Jane's Grey, and then a warm version and a cool version that I just use to start me off. So if I'm only painting a small area, I'll use one of those and add a bit more blue or a bit more brown to kind of get it as it should be. I have got on the way to me at the moment some of the really large pans that Winsor & Newton sell, the large pan I think they call them, or the giant pan, which are a porcelain like this. Actually, they're about the size of... They're roughly the size of 2 sections of my mixing palette. And then it is actually extruded paint, it's not poured. The actual extruded block is in the middle, and I think it's something like 4 times as much paint as a full pan, so 8 half pans worth of paint, but it's the price of about 3 half pans, and it comes in a gorgeous porcelain reusable palette, which stack, and they're lovely, so I'm really looking forward to trying those out. Anyway, I have bought French ultramarine and burnt sienna because I use them a lot, to enable me to make on the go variations on that brown. So a lot of us use that mixture, and a lot of people use those pre-bought tubes, but I want to talk about chromatic neutrals and what else one can use. So just to explain what I mean by chromatic neutral, imagine we're painting, and I've just plucked 3 random colours from my palette. These are Winsor & Newton professional colours. Antwerp blue, first of all, which is a chemically modified Prussian blue that is slightly more grey. It's a gorgeous colour, really nice for doing like background mountains at sunrise and so on. It's slightly granulating, but not too much. Scarlet Lake, which is a fairly standard scarlet, so a warm red, slightly yellowish red. And it being a lake, lakes always granulate, that's the clue is in the name there. And then Lemon Yellow Deep, which is slightly contaminated because the back of this was a test of one of Diane Reevely's inks, and I got some on the back. So granulating, wonderful zirconium praseodymium silicate there. One of the few rare earth colours used in watercolour, and I love it. Imagine we're painting using those as our primaries. So we've got a slightly cool blue, a slightly cool red, and a fairly cool yellow. And we can mix them, and if we mix the red and blue, we get this nice kind of granulating wine colour. We mix the yellow and the blue. Now there's a slight disadvantage of using this particular yellow in mixtures with a granulating blue because they slightly separate. I think you can see there that the yellow has come away from the blue a little bit, which might be what you want, but I don't like it too much. I can't think of a use where I'd like that. Maybe sunlight on water, who knows. And you can mix the red and the yellow, and again you get this beautiful granulation with the yellow kind of coming away from the red. The reason for that is that silicates are really hydrophobic, so any pigment that has got silicate on the end of it, like zirconium praseodymium silicate, like Potter's Pink and so on, are really water-hating pigments, so they will always, when mixed with water, try and get away from the water and clump together. And that act of clumping together is what we call granulation. And when they're mixed with another colour, they will tend to come out of the mixture a bit. So that's one of the properties of silicates. If we mix all three together, first of all, let's just think about what we're doing there. When we talk about the colour wheel and complementary colours, if we mix two complements together, we get a neutral or a grey. I think everybody knows that bit of basic colour theory who does any kind of painting. So what do we do when we mix all three together? Well, let's think of it this way. When we mix the blue and the red, we get a purple. Purple is the complement of yellow. So when we mix yellow and purple together, we're going to get a grey. You can think of it other ways. You can think of it as the red and the yellow making an orange, and the complement of orange is blue. You can think of it as the blue and the yellow make green, and the complement of the green is the red. So either way, you get a complement. So this is what you get if you mix all three, and you can see there's a bit of that yellow kind of super granulation happening there, and it's a lovely granular mix. It's really quite pretty, and that is what we would call a chromatic neutral because it's been mixed from the colours, the chrome comes from coloured basically, so you've mixed the colours that you're using in your real painting, and what you get as an advantage is that actually sits quite well with the primaries and the secondaries that I've made from them. It doesn't just sit well in terms of tone and undertone, but it also carries effects. So that high granulation, you've got there the granulation of the blue, you can see those dark blue specks, and you've also got the granulation of the yellow will be carried over in all of the mixes that you've got. So the great advantage of the chromatic neutral is that it matches everything you're using, both in colour, in tone, in undertone, and importantly, granulation, staining. It's going to give you very, very similar properties. And the nice thing with it is, if I take that chromatic neutral and mix it with the red, it will give me a kind of dulled down red. It won't go into some crazy mud. If I mix it with the orange that I made, it will give me a dulled down orange. It won't give me a crazy mud. So that's one of the nice things about making a chromatic neutral. A slight disadvantage of them is that they can sometimes be a little bit insipid. They can go a bit muddy, some combinations in particular. Now I've got 3 cool primaries here, but if I had 2 cools and a warm, or 2 warms and a cool, or 2 neutrals and a cool, or a neutral, a warm and a cool, I might, instead of getting a grey, get more of a brown. So you have to play and you have to understand, what am I going to get? So whenever you're selecting the colours for the painting you're going to paint, it's important you always swatch the secondaries and the chromatic neutral to see if you actually want to use them, because it might be that Scarlet Lake perfectly matches the colour of the ship that you're about to paint, but actually you may be better off mixing it from other colours to give yourself a more usable chromatic neutral if that doesn't do what you want. The alternatives are to use, firstly, what you can get in a tube, and this is only 2 of them because I don't have what is called neutral tint, which is sold as neutral tint, as I don't have that. So this is Paynes Gray here, which most acrylic painters use instead of black. It's a nice shadow colour and it's granulating. It's very, very softly granulating. Now that is made of PB15, which is phthalo blue green shade. There is PBK6, which is carbon black, which is why you've got that granulation, that sort of faux ultramarine look to it, and Pigment Violet 19, which is Quinacridone Violet, aka Permanent Rose, aka Quinacridone Rose. So you've mixed a pinkish red in with a greenish blue, and that's neutralized, and then the black's just there to give you granulation. The reason being that historically, if you look at the history of what Paynes Gray was historically, I mean, what we're really using these days is a Paynes Gray hue. It had a granulation to it, so in watercolour they respect and honour that. And you can see around the edges where it's a bit thinner, it does give quite a nice effect. You know, I don't dislike Paynes Gray, but if I were to use Paynes Gray with those colours, bearing in mind it's made from a cold blue and a cold red, it doesn't really sit quite as naturally. Maybe it does a little bit more with the blue, because it's made from a cool blue, but this is a fairly warm red, so they don't sit together very well. This chromatic would look better with these than it does, but it does show off when you put them together. The blue bias of Paynes Gray and the slightly yellow bias of that chromatic that I mixed up because I didn't do it very carefully. I just slapped it on the paper. And incidentally, this paper is Bockingford 425 GSM, which I think is 250, maybe 200 pounds. It's a pretty heavyweight Bockingford. Just some scraps that I'm just using up. The other grey that is often sold is this one, which is Davies Grey. Now this is a fairly new one on me. I bought it not long ago, kind of on a whim. I just wanted to see what it was, and it's quite an interesting cement kind of grey. And it's made with PG17, which is phthalo green blue shade, if I'm right. PBK6, which is carbon black. PBK19, which is slate, powdered slate. And PW5, which is lithopone, which is a white filler. The powdered slate is a traditional ingredient. Davies Grey is traditionally made from ground slate, the mineral slate. And slate is the mature form of the mineral shale. So if you ever see something, a little geology tip for you that I remember here, if you see something and you don't know whether it's shale or slate, get it wet or spit on it. And if it smells like wet soil, it's shale. And if it doesn't, it's slate. That's the only thing I remember from studying geology many years ago that's actually of any use. But if you grind down slate, the mineral, and you can mix it into paints and you can use it to make a Davies Grey. Now those other ingredients like the green and the black and the white are modern ingredients. I think historically the white was used along with the shale. The black's probably been used so they can get away with using less, slate, not shale. And the black has probably been added to allow them to use less slate. And the green is probably there just to give it a very, very slight difference in tone so that it's not entirely grey. It has got a slight greenness to it. And I've just realised, I think I'm lying to you. I think I've just mixed up in my head. That might be Viridian, actually. I think it is Viridian. Let me just check because I've got my greens written down. PBK, right, yeah, sorry, it's Oxide of Chromium. Sorry, total lie there. It is not made with phthalo green. It is made with Oxide of Chromium green, that horrible sludgy green. So if you've got Oxide of Chromium green and don't really know what to do with it, try mixing it with white, zinc white, and lamp black or carbon black, and you can get something similar to this. It won't be quite the same. So you've got a granular green, Oxide of Chromium green, you've got a granular black, you've got a granular other black, the slate, and you've got a smooth white. So that gives you these sort of black granules within a white matrix, and it's very pale. It has a limit. It's not, you know, you cannot make this any darker than it comes out of the tube. You could add carbon black to it, but you'll bias it. You could add Oxide of Chromium to it, but you'll bias it. And actually, I'm going to do that in a minute. I'm going to add Oxide of Chromium to this just to see what you get. So this is great if you just want a light grey, maybe to paint a wall in the distance, or you want it to be cement coloured, but it's not so good for mixing with things, whereas a chromatic neutral you can mix, like I said, with any of your colours. But if I were to mix Paynes Gray or Davies Grey with any of these colours, we'd get something weird. And guess what? I'm going to show you that in a minute. Just for completeness, Paynes Gray, that kind of traditional grey that we often use, which is Pigment Red 101, which is one of the iron oxides, and Pigment Blue 29, so French Ultramarine and Burnt Sienna in this case. You can see where the blue kind of granulates out. It's a gorgeous two-dimensional granular grey, and this is the pretty neutral version. I haven't really biased this one at all. I like it a lot. I think it's really useful, and you can make it really thick and dark, almost black. This is a pretty dilute wash, to be honest. Another one I use a lot, which I kind of call Paynes Gray Plus. You've got a lot of granulation going on here and some interest because I added another ingredient. If you add PV19, Quinacridone Violet, aka Quinacridone Rose, aka Permanent Rose, you get a kind of an undertone. And if you watch my video in the iCards about faking Rose of Ultramarine, Rose of Ultramarine is ultramarine with PV19. So this is that, then knocked down with a neutral, and you get a really interesting, I mean, I was slapping it together. I literally mixed the paints and put them on the page. So you have got some of the blue coming out there, and you've got some darker areas. But if you compare it with Paynes Gray as it normally stands, it does give you a much more rich colour. So Paynes Gray Plus, I think, is a really, really useful one to make if you want that kind of addition to your colours. There are alternatives you can do, like I know Raw Umber with PV19 gives you quite an interesting neutral as well, but I think this is really useful for rocks. That's where I would mainly use it. So let's just do a little experiment. First of all, I want to find a bit of paper that I can actually use the back of. Oh, bugger it, I'm going to paint over the top of that. First swear word of the video, sorry everybody. I'm just going to add some Davies Grey to some of these colours and just see, and some Paynes Gray actually, and let's just see what they do. So I'm doing the lemon yellow deep first of all. Now, there's one thing I dislike about this, because it's really hydrophobic, it tends to get stuck in the bristles of your brush, so it's not an easy one to get out. So we'll add Davies Grey to one of them. I'm actually going to add quite a bit. The shale, sorry, I keep saying that, the slate actually gives a very slight sparkle. It's very subtle, but it is there. Paynes Gray I've got just here. And with that being very blue, of course, we're going to get a green. I won't do it with all the colours. I'll do it with the red, because I think that could give one of the more interesting results. And then I'll hold these up so that we can look at them together, because that's the point. We're doing it together. God knows if my neighbours can hear me talking to you. I just think I'm completely bonkers. It's either that or they think I've got someone here that I'm speaking to who never gets to say anything in return. Either way, it isn't great. Okay, that's quite interesting. I'm going to put a little bit more red into that, because I think that was just caused by, yeah, that was just caused by my slight overload. What I was trying to do was get more of the base colour than I was of the neutral, because I wanted to make really certain this worked. So if we take the lemon yellow deep here and we add Davies Grey, we get, it just knocks it down, it doesn't do a lot. The Paynes Gray goes a bit green and a bit horrible. Down here, the Davies Grey in with the Scarlet Lake actually is quite pretty. There's a nice granulation there. It's like a shadow on a red object. And then the Paynes Gray with the Scarlet Lake actually gives quite an interesting red bias dark brown. So they would be useful if you just wanted to make more colours, but to show a shaded red or a shaded yellow, I think the Davies Grey would work, but the Paynes Gray certainly would not. So one might struggle there somewhat. I'm just looking for a scrap on the edge of a piece of paper so that I could do a oxide of chromium green in with Davies Grey just to see what it did. But I can't see any scraps of paper, and actually my oxide of chromium green isn't in the palette because I do glue gun walls between, oh, let me get you in focus. I do glue gun walls in between the wells to make them bigger, and the oxide of chromium was in one of them on another palette, and it leaked and got under the glue, so I had to clear it all out, so I'd have to get it out of the tube. No, not going to do that, can't be bothered. Sorry folks. I might do it in another video. So there you are. We've just gone through chromatic neutrals versus tube neutrals versus make-it-yourself neutrals. And I would say, wherever possible, if you want a natural look and you want to use it to darken other colours, to demonstrate shaded areas, make a chromatic neutral. It's really important. Whereas if you just want a really dark colour to use as a standalone, e.g. for rocks, for walls and so on, I think you can't go wrong with Paynes Gray or Paynes Gray Plus. And if you really want to, do try Paynes Gray and Davies Grey because they are useful. Someone must be using them for something. But that's really my judgment on it. I think Paynes Gray is more useful than Paynes Gray because it doesn't have that massive blue bias to it. And Paynes Gray, of course, coming from a tube, you can't easily adjust that too well. But if you want to make these yourself, if you want to make Paynes Gray, what I personally do is I mix them from the tubes with a palette knife, let it set in my palette, and then I reuse it. If you're making Paynes Gray Plus, and the reason I've just made this video is I've just made some more Paynes Gray Plus, I was using roughly equal French ultramarine and burnt sienna and a really quite small amount of quinacridone rose. You really only want about half as much paint in Winsor & Newton Pro anyway as you have of French ultramarine, and when you mix them all together it will have a bias of one of the colours. So if it looks too red you need to add more blue, if it looks too blue you need to add more red, and when you're adding more red that means burnt sienna and quin rose together, because what you're really aiming to do is kind of almost have 1 part blue pigment, half a part pink and half a part red, and that will work. But that does not mean that you're using 1 part blue paint to half a part of each of the others, because the pigment loads within paints are not equal. Some paints have got more pigment than others, and the size of the pigment molecule or the pigment grain also comes into play. So a gigantic pigment like yellow ochre, where the grains are really big, versus dioxazine violet, where they're really, really small, the same massive pigment per tube, of course, is more actual units of pigment, let's say. They're not necessarily molecules, they might be grains or particles, but it's more particles per unit volume than you would get in others. So the kind of staining capacity and the colour mixing are quite biased, so do keep that in mind. Please leave a comment below and let me know what neutrals you use. What are your favourite mixtures for giving you a really nice neutral, and how do you use it? If you've got any questions about use of neutrals or anything similar, please also put those below, and I will link to all the products used in this video, all of the colours, in 5mm tubes from Winsor & Newton, and if they exist in if they exist in pans, I will also link to those below in the video description so that you can buy them if you like the look of them. And I try to use Amazon UK, USA and Dick Blick when I do that, but Dick Blick doesn't stock half pans, it only stocks tubes, and it doesn't always stock all of the tubes. So I have to work with what I've got, and some people have commented before and said, why aren't you linking to pans from Dick Blick? I don't want to buy from Amazon. It's because Dick Blick doesn't sell them, unfortunately. So I have to work with what is available. And I usually try to link to half pans, full pans, and the large pans now that they're more widely available, because those large pans are really, really good value. The ones I've just ordered, the French Ultramarine large pan, I got it on sale. I mean, it's 23 quid normally. I got it for 15. a half pan is normally about £6-7 and a full pan about £15. So to get 4 times the paint, which would be like 60 quid, if you're paying 30, it's an absolute bargain. So for the colours you use a lot, those are a really good deal if you paint on a regular basis. And because they are extruded paint, they are the same recipe as normal half pans. So you haven't kind of got to learn again how much water to use and how to judge all of that. Just also want to point you to the fact that I've got about 7 videos recorded that I haven't yet uploaded because I've just not had time recently, what with my surgery last month and a few other things. Everything in my life has kind of backed up recently, so there will be a kind of bolus of videos just kind of plopped onto the internet hopefully soon to clear that backlog. And I have got something coming up on different types of paper for painting watercolor over stamped images, or Copic markering, or alcohol markering I should say, over stamped images, in which I'm testing different watercolor papers and some printmaking papers. And I kind of started that a long time ago, but I've finally finished the actual practical work. I haven't done it as a live on camera test. I've actually done all the tests, and I just need to film the video of me going through all of them with you guys so you can see them. But thank you all very much. Sorry for the bit of rambling at the end, but I wanted to tell you what's going on with my channel. And please leave a comment or a like. And if you like my channel, obviously subscribe, because it's totally free to you and it means you'll get access to all sorts of cool stuff, and you'll get notified by YouTube as soon as it's on air so you can watch it. Thank you very much. Goodbye.